welcome back. We are now back on the main stage. My name is Lina Odgaard. I am Global Press Advisor for DRC, and with me is Casper Klynge. Casper Klynge is Microsoft's Vice President of European Government Affairs with responsibility for Microsoft Government Affairs and Public Policy work. He also serves on the senior leadership team of Microsoft's Department for Corporate, External and Legal Affairs. And then prior to joining Microsoft, Casper served as Denmark's first, but also the world's first, ambassador to the global tech industry. And before that, also he worked with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He worked with the EU and with NATO for 2 decades in different locations around the world. And I've also been told that he actually used to work with DRC back in the days. So a very, very relevant and interesting background, and we are very happy to have you with us today, Casper.
Thanks a lot. It's really an honor to be here, so thanks a lot for having me.
So maybe actually we will start right off the bat. How do you see, or do you see, big tech influencing rights, especially rights of vulnerable people such as refugees and displaced?
Yeah, so you begin with a very difficult question from the outset. Okay, I wonder how this is going to go for the remaining minutes. But I think the main issue here is, of course, you have a focus on refugees, internal people with displaced people. You have a focus on sort of rights. But I think there is a global discussion right now which is about the impact and the role of technology writ large, the role of big technology companies like the one I represent, and how do you actually create sort of an interface where we all help out with global challenges, global issues, and I would definitely put, human rights, I would put democracy into the equation on that. And I think it's fair to say that in many ways, I think technology and the digital platforms, the digital technology we're developing has the opportunity to make lives better. We see that around the world, and we might talk a little bit about skilling and connectivity later on, but there is a fantastic opportunity that is brought about by 21st century development around technology. But there is also a flip side of the coin, which is, if we look at democracy, just to give you one example, I think we have to be honest in saying that some of the technologies, including some of the technologies we develop in Microsoft, is also challenging the ways that we have traditionally organized our societies, making it, for example, more difficult for local journalism to survive a digital economy where a lot of the advertisement has moved to digital platforms. So the bottom line to your difficult intro question is, I think we are at pretty much sort of a critical moment in our history where we have to come together. We have to have a pretty strong dialogue between civil society, between governments, between technology companies, and we have to make sure that we hold everybody to account. And that also applies for a company like Microsoft. We have to make sure that the technology we develop and deploy will be in support of democracy, will protect fundamental human rights, but will also help build better societies with more opportunities for people. And that's easier said than done, and that's why I think a conversation like the one we're having today, although I'm a little bit afraid of what comes next, is a good thing.
Well, actually, it's the points that you bring up are very interesting because I think, from my perspective, or maybe an outsider's view, you used to work with the Danish Foreign Service before crossing over to the private sector.
To the dark side?
Exactly. Okay, so that you could kind of say, you've been on both sides of the table, and now you've joined the dark side. Or how would you explain that transition?
I think the first thing is my company will not be happy about me referring to the dark side as being here. But of course, I faced a degree of criticism when I went from government to work for the private sector and for the technology company in this case. But let me give you sort of an explanation of why I actually think it is important that we have people moving in both directions. Because if you look back on what I did, both working for the Danish government, for the European Union, for NATO, it was very much about looking at some of the most important global challenges we had around. And the last job I had, which I was very privileged to get, was to try and hold the technology industry more to account. It was a political job. It was not about promoting, Danish companies abroad or attracting investments. It was really about going to the headquarters in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen or in Europe and say, we want you to make sure you don't spread disinformation. We want to make sure that your technology, your artificial intelligence is without biases so that we retain the fundamental European values that are so important in Europe. And what we were trying to do with the embassy to the tech industry was really to have an interface where we enabled, in my case, Danish authorities to transmit views, and sometimes very strong views, not very popular views, but it was also a way of trying to look into the crystal ball about what was happening in the ecosystem around technology and what potential impact could that have on the Danish society or on the European society. And I think that translation role was important, a few years ago. I think it's equally important today. And of course you can say, I get my salary to be fundamentally a lobbyist for a big technology company out of the US. But I think it would be appropriate to bring in a nuance, which is, yes, I help translate what we do in Microsoft, the new platforms, the new technologies we develop. I help translate that into a European context. But I also help translate Europe to my master sitting in Seattle and Redmond in trying to explain, what the hell is happening in Europe? How do we align our technologies with, in my case, what European stakeholders want? So in my view, creating that, common understanding is enormously important. And it is actually about influencing in both directions. It is also about me going back to our engineers saying, you might not think that privacy issues is fantastic to build into some of our platforms, but it's not going to disappear. It won't disappear in Europe. And I'm pretty sure that this will spread across the world, where you will have Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa increasingly focus also on privacy issues. So to some extent, you could argue that Europe is the canary in the coal mine. And if we get it right in building technology fit for Europe, then we actually set ourselves up for building technology that will ultimately do good for humanity and do better things around the world. And I think that's such an important conversation to have today.
Absolutely, and especially maybe some of the trends that you're seeing in the crystal ball. We'll get back to that in a little while. But I was thinking, with a background in diplomacy and policy in the area of big tech, then we are very keen to hear your perspective on a kind of a key question that has come up during this global event journey. So from your perspective, and especially sitting on both sides of the table, how should we, as the humanitarian sector, engage with big tech companies in a reality where they de facto shape so much of the infrastructure that all of us, and not least displaced people, have to work in or have our daily life in? What would be some of the advice that you could give to us?
Yeah, listen, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm in a position to give any advice that are valuable to you. I'm not an expert on humanitarian issues, but I will try and sort of attack that question from a direction, which is, what kind of future are we looking into? And if we look back over the last 1.5 years with the global pandemic, unfortunately, I'm sitting now in Copenhagen. I should have been in Brussels, but now Belgium is closed down again because of the rise in COVID-19 numbers. I think what has become crystal clear to all of us is how incredibly important it is to be connected. One thing. The other aspect that I think has been so revealing is you need fundamental digital skills in order to do well in an increasingly digital economy. We can throw a lot of numbers about the potential of the digital economy. I don't think that's so interesting, if you ask me honestly. I think what is very interesting is whether you are a citizen sitting in Europe or whether you're living in Southeast Asia, whether you are under very difficult circumstances in Africa, Asia, somewhere else. If you want to build a better future, if you want to have an opportunity to do well in the digital economy, you have to have connectivity, you have to have fundamental digital skills. So I think one of the lessons learned is that we have a dual responsibility, regardless of whether you work for a civil society organization, whether you work for a government, or whether you work for a technology company, to try and build out the basics for everybody to do well in a digital economy. And sitting here in Europe, I think we should just be very honest and frank. There are, of course, among political decision makers, a lot of concerns about migration challenges looking ahead. And if we look a little bit south to Europe, and we look towards Africa, I think what is so clear is that, in the old days, you might have refugees or migration for a variety of different reasons. I think what we increasingly will be facing is migration issues coming because people do not have an opportunity in a digital economy. And I think that is really a shared responsibility that we have to invest much more in. Besides Microsoft, I'm very lucky to serve on the board of a company called Bluetown that is focusing on last mile connectivity, working primarily in Africa, which is basically about creating a link in a village and then having a hotspot, sort of a very big Wi-Fi system where people then can come, log on, download content, whether it's for educational purposes or for healthcare or connecting with the governments. And I think that's such a massive both opportunity, but frankly speaking, also an ethical responsibility that we help build those systems out in Africa across the world. And that will actually help people do better, potentially reduce migration flows, but also help, I think, in a broader sense with some of the global issues that we're facing. There was a very long response. My apologies for that.
No, not at all. But I was thinking of what you were also saying now about ethics, and how much do you see ethics now being on the agenda of the global tech industry as a whole?
I mean, nobody's listening, so I can say things here, and nobody will hold me to account.
Of course,
okay,
it's a completely closed forum.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what I would say is that if I try to look into the crystal ball, and certainly the way we are trying to advise, our own leadership is that, there will be a line drawn in the sand, and I think that line will increasingly become stronger and deeper. And that is, are you doing good for society, or are you doing bad for society? And that's about democracy, it's about fundamental human rights, it's about data leakages, it's about privacy issues. And I would probably bet my money on, those companies that will increasingly be seen as doing what is not right will probably also have difficulties doing well from a business point of view moving ahead. So I think you will see companies doing much more in being moral, in being ethical, in doing what is right. And I think what is also clear is if you look at a company like Microsoft, we're present in many countries around the world. Most of our business is actually in democracies around the world. So I think as a company, we also have a very strong interest in supporting democratic values and also making sure that we help chip in with what we do to maintain those values. So I think ethics, moral, development of technology is going to be a key topic. And my guess would be that civil society organizations, media, the broader public will increasingly come to us and say, listen, you're not doing what is right. And that will potentially be a business problem as well.
Reflecting maybe, and now that was a little bit looking ahead, but also reflecting on the past year, what are some of the changes? Is that within the area of ethics in the agenda, or what are some of the major changes that you have seen?
Yeah, listen. One of the privileges of moving into a big technology company when you have as much gray hair as I have, and you were very kind to say I've been working for two decades, and I can document that's true. But it is actually to come inside a company and learn from the beginning, learn about what are we doing on machine learning and artificial intelligence, what is happening on cloud computing, how are our productivity tools really making a difference. And I'm not an engineer, I will never be an engineer, but it's been fascinating to see how revolutionary those products are going to be. And everybody will refer to AI, and there's no doubt about it that AI is going to have an impact on every single sector, regardless of where you work, regardless of how you have been working, and we need to help transition everybody to a world where artificial intelligence is going to be much more impactful. But I would probably say that cloud computing, and those two things are related, is the main game changer in the world that we're looking at, because cloud computing, the establishment of data centers, is going to be the foundation for the digital economy. And it's also one of those areas where I think the digital divide that we speak so much about, and we talked a little bit about it before, is going to come out the clearest. And it's not only about latency and having access to very fast computational capabilities. It's also about investments locally in the economy. It's about building up skills and competences with people. So I think cloud computing is not a temporary thing. It's something that's going to be here for a long time. And if I may add just two things on this, Line, cloud computing is great if you look at AI, but there are two other areas where it makes a difference. And I think that's a difference that is not only relevant in Europe, but in fact across the world. One is around sustainability. Climate change is here. We are just a few weeks out of COP26 that I guess, was sort of a medium success. But we also know that climate change is going to impact the world not evenly, and people that are already living under difficult circumstances might be impacted more than others. Going to the cloud is much more energy efficient than actually having a couple of servers in the basement downstairs. So I think that's one area we need to look at. The other one is a little bit a tougher issue, and that is around cybersecurity. Because whether we like it or not, cybersecurity is becoming a threat that is hitting everybody. And it's been one of the areas during COVID-19 where both nation-state actors and non-nation-state actors have been as active during COVID-19 as they were before. And they've become, I think, very unethical or very vicious in attacking critical infrastructure, attacking hospitals, first responders to COVID-19. And that is in many ways the foundation for our society. So we need to invest more in cybersecurity. And the cloud is actually one way of making sure that we can have data sets that are global, help protect our customers, help protect critical infrastructure. So that's another dimension where cloud is going to be critically important. And if I may add, I think developing economies, unfortunately, are more fragile and therefore potentially more vulnerable when it comes to cyber attacks that can fundamentally rip out the infrastructure of societies with huge human consequences afterwards.
Very interesting points, because I think from a humanitarian sector perspective, the infrastructure that we usually talk about are the ones that you can see and touch: roads, hospitals, whether there are banks and airplanes flying aid in and out. Like those are the traditional idea of the humanitarian sector. But why should we have our attention, or what is the importance for us for big tech and especially also cybersecurity?
Because I think cybersecurity is also a defense and a protection, and it's about sensitive personal data. If we take it from the lowest level, I'm sure there are issues you have on your devices that you would prefer to have private and not leaked, but that's more a personal aspect of it. But I think the other part of it, if you look at more authoritarian regimes, is of course you can misuse that information, especially if you have sensitive and vulnerable groups. And I think this is one of the main frontiers. How do we make sure that we do everything we can to protect people that are in a very difficult and vulnerable situations? And here the digital infrastructure is the new highways or the new train stations. And I think there are also opportunities for us to use this technology in a way that actually improves our response to difficult situations. We have in Microsoft a number of different programs around AI for humanitarian efforts. And just to give you one small example, if you have disaster management and you use big data and you use machine learning, in many ways you can make your response much more efficient and go in where it really matters, because you have a better overview, you have better information flow, you have real-time tools that can help you develop the right response. Just one example. Another example that I think is enormously, enormous opportunity for us is around agriculture, where of course you can use new technology, AI system to say, what are the right crops for that particular area? You can almost do micro agriculture, where specific seeds would work better in some areas and therefore raise productivity and the outcome of a specific area of soil. So I think, and perhaps that's one of the things that I learned moving also into the technology side, is that there are fundamentally no limits to what we can use new technology for. I think the challenge is that we have, again, I think a moral obligation to make sure that this benefits everybody around the world. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges as we look ahead. But the fundamental question, or the fundamental answer back to you, is that I think we need more dialogue, a more connected conversation where we also help look into how technology can be helpful to DRC and to other actors in the humanitarian field.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how would you see now we have this global event which brings us together and actually talk to each other, despite we might not meet under normal circumstances.
We are sitting together.
Exactly. How can we continue that conversation and make sure that we learn from each other's experiences?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm here is not only because I had some fantastic time working for DRC a long time ago, but also because I think actually the questions that you're putting on the table with this global event are questions that are key for the kind of world we're looking into. And I think it's a world that it holds enormous opportunities, not least because of the technology that we help develop, but it's also a world where technology is becoming a conflict area. I spoke a little bit about cybersecurity before, but I think also the dependency aspect of it is certainly something that I feel on my body every day. I don't know whether this has been a topic that you've been discussing here, but there is a very big discussion around digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy, not least here in Europe. And it is, if I sort of translate that, it is about being in control. It's about not being too dependent. And I think those are valid concerns, expressed by political leaders across Europe. I think the interesting thing is how do we respond to, an increased focus on sovereignty. And I think this is one of the areas in Microsoft. We developed something we call Tech Fit for Europe. Again, apologies to the global audience, but I am working out of Europe, which is to say, it is our responsibility also to help develop technology that gives control back to our customers or in this case European citizens. And I think that will spread across the world. But there is also a geopolitical dimension to this. And just before going to the dark side, I had a visit to Ghana, to Accra, and I remember very clearly sitting down with the Minister for Communications and IT and having a discussion about sort of the technology world and where the world was heading. And also talking about human rights, basic values, etc. And she said back to me, it's all fine. It's great that you come here and you talk about what we should be doing. But tomorrow, a representative from an Asian government is going to come here and basically offer critical infrastructure free of charge, no questions asked. And I think that also shows that there is let's say a battle or struggle out there, which is about what direction do we think technology should go in? Should it be a direction where you're in control about your data, where governments are in control about their data? In Europe, we've established something we call the EU data boundary, where people can then decide to have data localization happening in the EU and data processing happening in the EU at the same time. I think that's going to spread around the world. And I think there are some pretty fundamental values at stake here that really is a universal discussion that we need to focus a lot more on.
Yeah, yes, you said that you have, of course, naturally a European focus due to your role right now, but you have a lot of experience from working around the globe. So, the issue of privacy and maybe regulation, which is more on the European agenda, how do you see that around the world? Will that be just a big of a topic, or will that be the areas then where big tech company have free game?
No, I don't think it's a European phenomena, and in many ways, I mean, I think what is happening in Europe right now is, of course, you have a very ambitious regulatory agenda, which is about competition, it's about digital safety, it's about sustainability. There was a very big draft act on artificial intelligence. So I think what Europe is doing right now is to have sort of a holistic approach to regulating technology in a more systematic way than before. But we see that in many countries around the world. India is a super good example. We saw it in Asia. We've seen it in Latin America as well. So I think this is again a topic or a set of topics that are going to spread around. And I think there is a feeling, and we have to acknowledge that in the technology industry, that technology companies have become too powerful, too dominant in some areas, and that raises concerns. And I think rightly so raises concerns about how do you keep the democratic checks and balances that make sure that we also held to account when we do AI systems in Europe, or when we have our productivity tools, that customers, again, governments can be in control about that. And I think that will happen across the world. And I do think that there will be questions asked about different approaches to technology based on different traditions and different systems. And if we look at the transatlantic relationship between the US and Europe, sort of a very simplistic discussion that I often hear is that, you know, in Europe we're much more focused on privacy issues, and the US much more focused on national security issues. I actually don't think that's true. I think on both sides of the Atlantic, people are deeply concerned about privacy issues, and people are also deeply concerned about national security issues, about making sure that, you know, technology is not misused by, you know, cybersecurity attackers or terrorists or for radicalization efforts. And I think that discussion we have almost an obligation to bring together and find common approaches, both across the Atlantic but also on a global scale.
So maybe now to kind of end our talk a little bit, I would like to go back a little to, so what do you see if you go back to your crystal balls? What are some of the things that we should worry about, and what are things that are actually bringing new opportunities, not least in light of COVID-19, which has maybe made us even more addicted to being connected?
You know, on Thursday and Friday, I was in Berlin, in Germany, for a visit for a number of different conversations. But I also visited a school that we support called the Ready School, and it's sort of a, you know, an interesting program. I think they have a presence in Denmark as well, but in different cities around Germany. And you know, I can't do them justice, but I will give you sort of a short version of what I think they're involved in, which is giving basic digital skills to asylum seekers or refugees living in, you know, unclear circumstances in Germany. And I had the opportunity to sit down with, I think, 20 students and sort of hear their stories. And they came from Afghanistan, they came from, you know, Africa, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia. But they all had one thing in common, that there was a pretty ambitious view on how do we make sure that we get the skills that will be required by the workforce of tomorrow. So they did, you know, Java programming, Python, you know, they were looking at cybersecurity, etc. And I think, in my view, that is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to be facing, because unfortunately what we also saw during COVID-19, and I'll just speak about Europe, is that there was a massive transition from real life to virtual, but we also saw that the consequences of that move didn't hit, you know, people equally. So we know that women were harder hit by that transition. We also know that traditional sort of blue-collar workers were much harder hit with greater unemployment because of that transition. And I think the only response to that is to really double down on education, on giving skills and competences that are going to be required. And, you know, before we went live here, I mentioned one small example of which was sort of a learning process for me. A company in Italy, you know, of all things, a winemaker, that because of the lockdowns was really struggling with its business, a very small business, 10 people or so. And what I saw was we could actually help that company go virtual. And you sort of say, you know, wine company and wine tasting, how do you make that a virtual event? But it actually succeeded, small packages being sent out to customers. And what happened was that company actually is doing better today than it did before COVID-19. And in many ways, it's a ridiculous example to use when you're talking about real global, really difficult challenges. But I think it just shows that all sectors are going to be impacted. And if we don't build the necessary skill sets and, you know, the digital infrastructure connectivity, it's going to be very difficult to make it in a digital economy. And again, I think that's a global responsibility where this conversation is super helpful.
Thank you, Casper. It was really a pleasure talking to you and listening to all your different experiences from different sides of the table. It is now time for a lunch break. Remember to use the networking facilities here on Hopin. And then we will be back here on the main stage in 30 minutes with Asim Azar. Thank you so much, and thank you, Casper.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.